You're listening to Podcasts with Park Rangers, a show where we bring to you stories of the national parks and historic sites from those who know them best, park rangers. Get to know each park ranger and their love for the parks as we discuss history, science, and the beauty of nature from a unique perspective. I'm your host, Lucas VK, and this episode is brought to you by our Patreon fan of the month, David, down in New Orleans, Louisiana, home of New Orleans Jazz National Historic Site. Today we interview Fred Bunch, the Chief of Resources Management at Great Sand Dunes National Park.
The poem about when I heard the learned astronomer and suddenly I got confused and restless, and I went outside and stood in silent amazement of the stars. Do you have an opportunity to come to this park? Go out on the dunes and stand in silent amazement of the stars.
Stay tuned. We'll talk about elk and bison management, the booming sands phenomenon, and the legend of the frogs. At the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in Colorado lie the tallest sand dunes in North America. The blowing sand seems to indicate an extremely dry climate, but deep underneath the sand lies an aquifer 1 mile deep, and from this aquifer, a whole system of life. A walk amongst the dunes in the summer leads to discoveries of sunflowers, kangaroo rats, and even amphibians. And the most strange of all, a seasonal beach. In wet years, Medano Creek flows past the base of the dunes in the summer, and families play in the newly created shore. The creek is the lifeblood of the dunes, and it even has a heartbeat. The water flows across the sand, building up dams which break and cause slow, pulsing waves to make their way across the sands. These waves can be up to a foot high. The rhythmic pulse of Medano Creek is called surge flow and is found in very few places in the world. As summer moves to fall and winter, the creek dries up to a trickle, and most of the water stays beneath the sands, only to reappear in the spring when the snow melts and the creek surfaces once again. The water is crucial to the dune formation. In a sense, it holds them together and allows these towering behemoths to exist. But how did the dunes get here? What other life lives amongst the dunes? For that, we speak with Fred Bunch, the Chief of Resources Management at Great Sand Dunes National Park.
Oh, welcome to Great Sand Dunes. Brought to you by the Southwest Wind. That's our sponsor. Oh.
As you can tell, Fred's quite the character. He's been with the Park Service since 1978, a ranger at 8 different parks, and he's been at Great Sand Dunes for almost 30 years. His role and the park have changed over the years.
Started as an interpretation and moved into resources management. And in that time that I've been here, I've seen a lot of changes here. It was a small monument at the time, and then it expanded in 2000 to include much more of the sand sheet, the Sopka, and the mountains. And so in 2000, legislation was passed that created the Park and Preserve, and it went from around 38,000 acres to 140-some thousand acres of park and preserve that we are responsible for protecting.
Fred's love of the outdoors and science led him to become a park ranger.
Being a park ranger was kind of right up my alley of what I was interested in. I liked the outdoors. I liked the aspect of being outside, and in school I took a lot of science classes that related to botany and geology and things like that were looking at things outside and how the earth works, and then the cultural side too, the archaeology that I had in school. It's all here, and it's all part of the story, and so it's a multidisciplinary endeavor, but they complement each other.
It's evident Fred resonates with the preservation aspects of the National Park Service.
I like the philosophy behind the Park Service about this. They say it's America's greatest idea. It's like, this is why we have the ability to protect these areas and not consume them, and to set them aside for our enjoyment, but future generations. So we're thinking in the future for quality visitation, and that even if people come here once and see it and say, oh, it's great, or never make it here, that to know that it's here is reassuring. Somewhere I read a quote about Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who came to the American West and said, only in America could they afford such deserts. And it's beautiful to be in a sand dune that isn't expected for anything extraction-wise. We're not trying to get anything out of it. It's just here for your enjoyment and the protection. And along that line, there's a lot of great spin-offs of having a protected area. And wildernesses fit into that category as well, as the dark night sky, the natural quiet, the things that the opportunities for solitude that people seek that live in urban areas. People that come from the city come out here and say, what's that sound? And it says, there's no sound. It's just total silence. And then also the night sky. And night sky, you can consider it also a cultural resource. That's where all the stories come from, is the heavens. And they always say half the park is after dark, or the right to starlight, and these things. And so these values that are here need to be protected, need to be recognized, need to be interpreted, and definitely will be appreciated. Right now, for example, we're doing a traditional use study where we're bringing tribal elders into the park, and one of the key things that we're asking them about is ethnobotany, is uses of plants, if they're willing to share the use of it. And because this area is protected, that's a spin-off of that. The stuff is still here. And that's motivation for us to remove non-native plants, is to keep this place intact, these islands of hope, as they've been referred to.
So there's that, not only the natural beauty and the natural resources, but the human history and the cultural background, all can be respected and preserved.
And interlocked.
Sure.
That you can't talk about one without talking about another, and the stories and there's many, many histories, many, many stories that have applied to this wonder of nature.
Yeah, we talked earlier about nothing existing in a vacuum, that everything has kind of an interplay.
Right.
And nowhere is it seen more, I think, than a special place like here at Great Sand Dunes.
Yeah. And that's why it's important that all components of the system are allowed to function as they have. And, we aren't, we're not actively involved in changing anything. We're just kind of monitoring and watching what happens and making sure that it exists. And we can improve on this too. We can improve by controlling non-native plants and animals, and by restoring native animals and plants.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of diverse ecosystems here.
That's a very good point, Lucas. If you just even stand and look outside and you look down to the sapka and the sand sheet and the dunes and the pinyon juniper and the montane and the krumholz and the tundra, all these different life zones, and animals interact differently in them and go back and forth. And the plants, the vegetation is distinct, largely due to elevation, to precipitation, these kind of things.
In this sort of high desert area.
Exactly. And that's kind of a thing that's a real interesting and unique here. And speaking of unique, we have some insects that are only found on the dunes of the Great Sand Dunes. The Great Sand Dunes tiger beetle is endemic. It's only found here. And there's other insects like that are unique and endemic. But that one's really particular of interest because, as we just talked about, everything's related, everything's interacting. The Great Sand Dunes tiger beetle was first identified by a priest from a local parish. And he was here when he wasn't doing his responsibilities as a priest. He was an avid entomologist. And so he would go out and look and collect insects. And he was here collecting this particular insect, and it was new to science. Only found at Great Sand Dunes. And his name was Bernard Roger. He's from Spain originally. But that's, if he wasn't here, if he hadn't been here to doing this other thing, we would not know about this tiger beetle, Great Sand Dunes tiger beetle.
So more about the dunes as a resource. It's really interesting in visits here how these dunes are formed, which is because of this sort of unique setup. I'm wondering if you could describe how did the sand dunes form? They are the biggest dunes in the USA. Is that correct?
Tallest. These are the tallest dunes, and these are mountains of sand. These are the tallest dunes in North America. And they're a result of probably the tale of two mountain ranges, where you had the San Juan Mountains to the west were formed by volcanoes, and the Sangre de Cristos were formed by uplift or faulting.
Mm-hmm.
And in the time since, they've been weathered and then filled in this basin where the Rio Grande flows through. And so there's sand deposits out there, and then the wind carries sand across this valley and then meets this Sangre de Cristo,
Mm-hmm.
and the wind funnels through. It's the Bernoulli's principle, where the wind will funnel through and it'll leave behind the sand particles. But it's not always one wind direction. So you have wind coming from the northeast to the southwest that pushes the sand back out. So it flip-flops and they grow vertically,
Mm-hmm.
creating these huge, huge dunes.
Yeah, creates sort of a vortex right here in the foot of the mountain range.
And then the Medano Creek and Sand Creek situation, where you have sand being transported by the water, and it's being carried back out and to be blown back in. So it's kind of a recycling thing. It's an important piece of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And the mechanism that does that is the surging or the pulsating flow.
Right. Yeah, let's talk more about that. You've touched on Medano Creek and this surge flow. This flow happens usually after snowmelt. Is that
Right.
correct? Yeah.
Yeah, the creek gets its water from snow that lands in the sangres, and then as it in the spring runoff, it'll melt. But then as it flows past the dunes, it'll go over what we call anti-dunes, these ridges. And as it goes up the dune, it loses velocity and drops sand, and then it comes down and increases velocity and picks up sand. So these ripples, these anti-dunes, will build in front of your very eyes, and then it will flush through in this supercritical flow wipe that slate clean and then start to build again.
Right.
And it's, the USGS has studied it, and other people have looked at it, and it's one of the best examples of that phenomena in the world.
Yeah, it very rapidly sort of creates these dams,
Right.
And which it then eradicates very quickly.
Yeah, and it's really amazing to watch. They'll build and then they'll sweep clean, and it's almost you could set a watch to it. There's 15 seconds, or depends on the flow, of course, but that'll surge through and then sets up again, surge through and sets up again.
Yeah, we've had a lot of fun going out there during these surge times, and like, that one's about to break.
Yeah, that's right.
So the Medano Creek is dry this year, or probably will not get much of a creek. So it kind of shifts from year to year?
Yeah, a lot of the runoff from Medano Creek, all the runoff from Medano Creek is dependent upon snowpack. And as you can see, on the mountains there's very little snow. So it's, unless we get major precipitation events fairly soon, there probably won't be much of a creek. Interesting though, it flowed most all the winter because we had some good rains in the fall. And I don't know if it saturated the aquifers that allowed it to flow. And then of course in the winter there's a less evaporation and less utilization of plants, evapotranspiration.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So there are flows not only in the spring. Occasionally it will happen.
It flowed in the winter because of the precipitation events that occurred then. In the spring now it's receded back up, but as it starts to come out of the mountain front, it has to kind of fill the bucket, so to speak. It has to saturate its bed as it advances. So it has to wet all the sand beneath it. And so it'll increase in distance away from the mountains.
I see.
Medano Creek is wonderful scientifically because of that surge flow phenomena, but also an incredible recreational area. It's Colorado's only beach. On a hot July afternoon, you'll see 95% of the people in the creek and 5% out on the dunes wishing they were in the creek.
Right.
And the sand gets really hot, but then you have this opportunity to really cool off and refresh. And it's so much fun seeing families come here and the kids just play. That's really rewarding for us to see that opportunity. And it's still going on generation from generation, that it's still here and still have a blast.
Makes for a great day at the beach here in Colorado.
And then the kids get
elevation.
sunburned, and then it's just, they always pass out, and but they play till they're exhausted, and That's a pretty good opportunity.
And as you say, by going out there and making full use of the creek, they're perhaps making a higher concentration of impact, but the impact isn't all that severe in terms of resource management.
In terms of visitor impact on the creek or the dunes themselves, it's small.
Right.
It's diapers will get away from people, and the creek will carry them out, or water bottles or something like that. But litter is one thing. Once people get there, walking on the dunes is very, very little impact, and even sandboarding, because there's not a lot of vegetation that anchors the sand, and so
makes it very resilient.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have an incredible natural quiet. If you get away from the creek and the recreational part of that, there's some areas on the north side of the dunes that are some of the quietest places in the national park system. And we've measured the background sound. But then on the other hand, the dunes themselves sing. And it's a phenomena called booming sands. When it's dry and windy, the sand will slide, and it makes a sound like a cello, like a droning type of, and it has to do with the uniform size of the sand. And the avalanche action, sets up this vibration, and it's an amazing phenomenon.
Wow.
And it's called the booming or the singing sands. First time I heard it was I was way out on the Star Dune, and it was a clear day, and we set off an avalanche, and it just resonated for a while. Just we've been able to record it, and we put it on our website under the Science and Nature piece of that. And it's one of the things too is if your principal resource sings, you better pay attention to it, listen to it.
Just kind of shifting gears, you mentioned the night sky designation, a project that you guys are working on getting. So what goes into that process?
We'd like to have the Great Sand Dunes designated as an International Dark Night Sky Park. And there's 3 pieces of that nomination, and we're working on that. The one piece of it is that we have to show that it's dark. And there's an instrument called the Sky Quality Meter, and it's right up on that shelf there, where we go out, and when there's no moon and it's clear, no clouds, we can get a reading and quantify how dark it is. See, that's the new thing to this, is you can actually give it a value.
Yeah.
We've been doing quite a bit of readings when the sky's clear and there's no moon, and get a value. So, and the darkest the meter goes is 23, and we've gotten some 22 readings. So that's number one, is we got to show that it's dark here. Number 2 is we have to show that we've taken efforts to clean up our own backyard, so to speak, in shielding our external light features, doing things that are responsible for preservation of the night sky as a park.
Keeping that light pollution down.
Correct. Yeah, keeping the light pollution down and taking actions that we can, like motion sensors on external lighting, things like that.
Right.
The third piece of that is the education part of it.
Okay.
Where we have night sky rangers in the summer that do star talks, and that talk about the value of the darkness and the right to starlight.
Okay. So that all works together to achieve this designation and really preserve darkness as another resource.
Exactly. Yeah. The darkness is part of an expectation. When people come to the Great Sand Dunes and they know they're wilderness, or they go to a place that's a wilderness, you expect it to be dark. You expect it to be quiet. And so that's one of the things that we want to celebrate, is how dark it is, and that again, a large percentage of our populations are from urban areas. And to go out at night in a city and see the Milky Way that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And the poem about when I heard the learned astronomer, and suddenly I got confused and restless, and I went outside and stood in silent amazement of the stars. So you have an opportunity to come to this park, go out on the dunes, and stand in silent amazement of the stars.
So that opportunity is here at Great Sand Dunes because it is a 24-hour park.
Right. And the gates, we don't close the gates. and you can go out on the dunes in the evening, and that's one of the best times to see it. And I think night sky is a cultural resource as well. I mean, you look at it scientifically and talk about all the different stars, but you can look at, that's where our stories come from. That's where our myths, that's where our legends, that's where, so much of our imagination comes from. And, every people across the planet through all time have looked up at the sky and had their own interpretation of what's up.
Yeah, humanity has always been inspired by the cosmos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then the question comes up, are there more stars in the sky than grains of sand at the Great Sand Dunes?
Do we have an answer for that?
Well,
it's just a
I've
question.
I've asked people a lot smarter than me, and they say there are more stars in the sky.
Okay.
And you're dealing with infinity.
Yeah.
And the dunes, Andrew's measured how much sand's here, and we have it's about 6 billion cubic meters of sand, I think.
It can be quantified. You can put a huge number on it, but it's smaller than infinity.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. How do you measure that? How do you measure grains of sand?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we were getting better at that.
Okay.
Started off with GIS and looking at the sand, but now we're using LiDAR, light distancing and ranging, and looking at the areas of the dunes, and then you can figure out from a cubic meter of sand ultimately, or approximately, I should say, how much sand is in there, and multiply that out.
Sure. So it's still estimates.
It's a great science fair project.
Yeah. Get out there and count every grain.
Yeah. But yes, it's an estimate.
Sure.
And it's just that, but LiDAR has really helped us in a lot of things, and looking at dune movement, looking at, so many features on the ground.
So that allows you to see perhaps kind of the ripples and the textures and
exactly,
and quantify on that sort of three-dimensional level.
Right. Yeah.
Very cool. So you mentioned ranches nearby. I think we talked on the phone about a bison ranch.
The Medano Ranch to the southwest of the park is owned by the Nature Conservancy.
Okay.
But the previous owner was a fellow that brought the bison into this area, and then the Nature Conservancy purchased the ranch from him. Then the Conservancy runs bison out there. I think currently about 1,700 head, and they have an agricultural leasee that runs the operation that's within the legislative boundary of the park, and the park is interested in acquiring those lands. And so the question now, that when we purchase the ranch, do we continue the bison operation? So that's what we're doing with this ungulate management plan. That has two pieces of it. Well, actually three pieces of it. One is management of bison. Second one is management of elk. And the third one is landscape condition and desired habitats for that. And so the grass that's eaten by a bison is about the same as the grass eaten by an elk, but the key thing is that the landscape is healthy and robust, and there are principles that guide us in that, but this is a decision that we have to make, and so we want the public's input on our decision.
Right.
We would allow the Nature Conservancy to operate the ranch as long as they own it, and then enter into an agreement where they could run it for a few years as we phase in, and we would probably reduce the numbers significantly.
The number of bison.
The number of bison significantly, and then look for non-introgressed bison as part of the DOI herd, Department of Interior bison conservation herd. And then the key thing, though, is always the landscape health.
So the difference here between bison and elk, the bison are more domesticated versus wild, and then the elk, of course, are kind of a wild population.
That's right. The elk are a wild population. They move all across the landscape, refuge lands, forest lands, park lands, private lands. But the bison are fenced, and they're only on that Medano Ranch piece.
Okay. And yet they interact with one another and with the land.
Correct.
In significant ways.
Elk are everywhere, and bison are in key places. And we have research plots out there looking at what happens if you don't allow bison or elk in these areas, and what the landscape looks like. Because in this business of preservation of natural lands, we want to pay attention to all pieces of the community. We want to allow opportunities for ground nesting birds, for amphibians, for for all critters. And if you have an area that's heavily grazed, it minimizes those opportunities.
Domestication of animals has a larger impact than just the elk. There are
right.
other concerns, wildlife related and land.
The situation now is an agricultural operation.
Right.
And what we're trying to move toward is a more of a Park Service operation.
Yeah.
And, in that we would want to be more inclusive of the diversity of animals and plants.
Yeah. The Park Service mission being very different from that land management.
Exactly. The Park Service is wanting to have that as more of a restoration and look at a bison that are 100% bison. There are no cattle DNA involved in them, and we have an opportunity to do that now with a chance to reboot, so to speak, the bison, and so that they would be part of this overall Department of Interior preservation concept.
Okay. You talked about fish management as well while we're on animals. What sort of concerns are there from a resource perspective for your operation here?
Well, this is kind of a thing, Lucas, where we're wanting to complete the park. And in the 80s, there was the Forest Service and the Colorado Parks and Wildlife restored Medano Creek to the native Rio Grande cutthroat trout. And so it can be done. And these creeks, both Medano Creek and Sand Creek, are ideal candidates for a restoration of native fish. And it's really important.
Are there a lot of non-native fish then?
In Sand Creek there are.
Okay.
Medano Creek is got just the Rio Grande cutthroat and the Rio Grande sucker. And those are native fish.
Okay.
Sand Creek has non-native fish in form of rainbow trout, brook trout, non-native cutthroat trout, like they call it the Pikes Peak hybrid, and then cutbows, which would be a cross between rainbows and cutthroats. So our mission is to try to remove non-natives and stock it with the Rio Grande cutthroat. And we're working on that. We're going to be doing an environmental assessment on that. The reason why we're doing that is there are many, but one of them is it's in a national preserve, and it's Park Service policy says native species. So that we have non-native, we have cut and butts in there right now, and
there's some crossbreeding going on.
Right, and it's just So number one, Park Service policy. Number two, it's in wilderness. Wilderness says native, species. Number three, we're doing it for the species. The Rio Grande cutthroat trout has been stressed out a little bit. The numbers of creeks that have the native cutthroat are they're not that many. This would give that species an incredible habitat of 15 miles of creek, still allowing for recreational fishing.
Okay.
But
really giving them a fighting chance, these native species.
So there's a lot of interest in having this trout listed, and if we can increase the habitat for it, that may prevent it from being listed. We want to protect it, plus it's fish that should be there.
Sure. We've talked about the fact that this is a very durable park. So in that sense, preservation may be a little easier than some of the more sensitive ones. There are a lot of places to play in the dunes. You mentioned going out and spending time sledding on the dunes, or spending time in the creek as a beach day. So you can go sledding, hiking, camping. So what kind of impact do we need to be aware of that we might have on the area when we do any of those activities?
Well, I like to consider the dunes kind of user-friendly.
Yeah.
As a pedestrian, you're not going to hurt them. Very few national parks that I've worked at, this is the only one that I know of. We could encourage you to write your name Lucas in 15-foot letters on the side of a dune, and it'll be swept clear. I guess the thing that the congestion and the numbers and the parking, sanitation, things previously mentioned, but the dunes, I think, is, you're not going to hurt them if you're just walking on them.
Right. So they are very robust. There may be sensitive areas coming into them that we should be aware of.
Correct. And, it's, if you contrast the dunes with tundra, tundra is similar because they're very, low vegetation. The dunes has some vegetation, but the tundra, doesn't handle impacts like people walking on or sliding down on a sandboard
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Yeah. Very different sort of awareness goes into each.
Right.
So you mentioned the high visitation. You had 500,000 people or
Close
so
to it,
last year,
right.
Which is a record for Great Sand Dunes.
Mm-hmm.
How do we deal with this influx? I know there's a responsibility through education, but also just from an infrastructure standpoint. What are some of the challenges that need to be met in those huge surges of visitor?
Well, trying to make sure, do the best we can to provide for a good experience, and try to move the line in the interstation faster. Looking at options of parking. We've doing some congestion management studies and things like that. And as I said, though, once you get here and once you park and you get on the dunes, you can get away. You can get to the solitude fairly quickly by going off a different direction from where most of the people go up to the high dune.
Yeah.
But encouraging maybe visitation during the low use seasons and things like that.
Yeah. Avoiding those popular high trafficked times. And I suppose if you have to be here during the heavy times, patience is a virtue.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So you mentioned your personal goal to create a landscape in which you can't identify it as being from a particular area. I really like that idea.
Timeless, and you look across the land and you see the dunes, or you see the ranch with the bison, and see these other areas of the park and preserve, and you can't tell what year it is.
Mm-hmm.
You're on the right track. I mean, we've always got better improvements to do, but it's kind of a timeless thing. You can't see any non-native plants, or you can't see any disturbances of any kind that shouldn't be there.
Mm-hmm. So nothing that would lock it into an era.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We're downwind from a large farming community, and so whatever happens out there will eventually end up here.
Uh-huh.
We on the west side of the dunes every so often find balloons, from somebody's birthday party that the wind caught and took them over here, boy. Or different things that end up here. Siberian elm trees showing up that aren't native here, but they have wafer-like seeds that are transported across the valley.
Okay. Yeah. So seeds get blown in, and then balloons, which are like happy birthday. that was the year, right?
Right. Yeah. When you talk about resources of Great Sand Dunes, there's world-class resources here. Mm-hmm. Number one, the dunes. Those are the tallest dunes in North America. They're world-class. They have reversing or what they call Chinese wall type dunes. Other world-class resources are the surging in the creek. Mm-hmm. The way the creek flows and that pulsating or wave-like action is the best example in the world of that, from what the USGS has told us. The endemic insects are world-class and very important. The night sky, the natural quiet are very, very important and very pristine. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's really key here is in our cultural realm. We have some of the oldest archaeological sites in North America.
Really?
And what we have is the Paleo-Indian sites. And Paleo-Indian are the folks that made their living on the now extinct megafauna, the mammoth, the bison, the saber-toothed tiger, these things that from way back. And there's a kill site on the south end of the park from 9,000 years ago where Folsom hunters killed several bison. And these are the bison, the Ice Age bison, Antiquus, the big bison. And they butchered them up and there's a site that the Smithsonian has been studying for quite a while. 9,000 years ago, there were people here utilizing the animals and the plants of this area. Really quite a legacy and world-class in the archaeological realm.
Yeah. So many different studies can find interest here, as is the case at a lot of parks, but I feel like you've connected with Great Sand Dunes. Of course, you are born and raised in this area. Mm-hmm. We talked about over the phone, so not on the record, but I'd like to hear you talk a little more about the legend of the frogs.
Oh, yeah. Well, geologically, it's been verified that volcanic activity in the southern part of the valley dammed the Rio Grande from about 2.5 million years ago to about 400,000 years ago, creating Lake Alamosa. And about 400,000 years ago, the lake breached and Lake Alamos drained to the south down through the Rio Grande Gorge area. But when the lake was in existence, there were numerous frogs. And these frogs are very happy. And it's just like, when frogs said to the others, time is fun when you're having flies. But when the lake drained, all the frogs died. But their spirits are still here.
Okay.
So if you spend enough time here, a frog spirit will get in you. And you can leave, but you always end up coming back.
Mm.
And I see people that I grew up with and things that moved on to other places, and they come back and they say, oh yeah, we're moving back to the valley. He says, oh, the frog spirit got you, So that's the tale of the frog.
Yeah. So you feel the frog spirit definitely got a hold of you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like maybe we have some frog spirits from our time here. We've returned here now. This is our 4th visit.
Yeah, see, yeah.
So what is your favorite thing about Great Sand Dunes?
My favorite thing about Great Sand Dunes is that it's an incredible resource, and there's great people that are here to protect it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a wonderful combination. People are very dedicated to understanding the resource and interpreting the resource, but the resource is, as I said, a fun one in that you're not going to hurt it, but we're constantly learning more about it, and there's research going on. So it's a fun place, and people come here to enjoy it, but to learn too.
Mm-hmm.
But you can do both. You can have a great time hiking and running up the dunes, and then learn about how unique it is and how important it is that it is protected.
I think the story of the priest speaks to that. He discovered something very unique, but was seeking perhaps just solitude and a little bit of enjoyment of the dunes when he did.
And discovering the natural science.
Mm-hmm. What makes Great Sand Dunes special to you? Is there anything that you particularly feel while you're here? You've returned here to your sort of boyhood home, and you've worked here for a couple decades now.
Mm-hmm. Pleased that it's headed the direction that it is, because when I started here, there was threats, external threats, and real concern, and people like this place, and they, people are united, and that's one of the things. Support groups, communities,
different
things like that. And I think that was kind of a good thing to see in a threat, that people locked arms and said these dunes are the biggest stick to beat off threats. And so I'm pleased at the direction it's going, and we're continuing to discover and learn about how to best protect this resource. And these projects that we're working on are challenges, but they feel like they're very important to do. And
so it's fulfilling work.
Yeah. Plus they tell you what to wear.
Yeah. Well, it's
one less
great.
Decision.
Yeah, it's great to hear.
Today I'm going to wear green pants and a gray shirt. Okay.
Yeah. Makes it easy. Allows you to focus on the passion that you have for this place.
Yeah.
So, what is the importance of the national park system as a whole? You've made it kind of a lifelong career at this point. Why is it important to preserve the National Park Service?
The National Park Service is really important to me, and I think the reason why is I'm very aligned with the value and the philosophy of the National Park Service. We're fortunate that this country has this idea, and it says it's America's best idea. And it's the thing that I like about it, it's easy to remember. Our mission is clear: protect our resources and serve our visitors. We're not multiple use. We're not anything else. We're just here for the resource and for people to come and see it as it is and enjoy it. Growing up, our family would take numerous trips to national parks and explore and enjoy and participate in the ranger program and things like this. And so I always kind of thought it was really a great idea and a great concept that these areas are protected, and that you could come back and see it. It's still here, and visitors come up to me and say, have those dunes grown in 30 years? And I go, no, our data shows that not a lot of increased growth. So what do you ask? Is, well, I was here when I was 15 and I climbed them, and now I just now climbed them and they seem a lot higher. Things change, but that's the thing that we try to keep it as constant as it needs to be. If change, it's not because of humans doing this change, it's because of the nature. As they say, nature bats last. And that's the important thing, is that we listen to what nature's telling us on.
And allow that to persist through generations.
That's right. And that's the key thing in what you're doing is reaching younger people, understanding the importance of these protected areas, and because that's our greatest natural resource, is the minds of our young people, and that
Walter Elias Disney.
And they say that parks can come and go if the public doesn't appreciate them like we appreciate them, or like I appreciate them. I should speak for myself.
I think we all appreciate them.
Okay. You're here. You're here.
Yeah. I think our listeners certainly appreciate them.
Yeah,
I would
that's
hope
right.
so.
Yeah. Well, no, I hope so. And that's the key thing, is that the public knows the significance of national parks, and even if they don't visit them, they know that they're here for them.
Sure. And
that they can visit them and return to them. There's parks that are just asking for you to come. They're singing. The singing sands are saying, come to visit.
A little cello music.
That's right.
Are the singing sands beckoning for you to visit the Great Sand Dunes? Or perhaps one of the other national parks? Or maybe you visited this area before, and a frog spirit is calling you back. Its unique features, found in few places in the world, are why Great Sand Dunes National Park is one of the crown jewels of the park system. Whether you're joining the families to play on the only beach in Colorado, seeking solitude within the dunes, or sitting in silent wonder under the dark night skies, we hope we've inspired you to pay this park a visit. If you enjoyed what you heard, subscribe to our show on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. And for more fun featuring Fred and content we had to cut, consider joining our Patreon community. Links are posted to the show notes in the description, or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com. Stay with us through the final minutes for a short preview of our next episode. We like to highlight on our show ways that a typical park visitor can give back to their national parks. The Friends of the Dunes is a non-profit citizen support group for Great Sand Dunes National Park. They've provided research grants, materials for the Junior Ranger program, and telescopes for the Night Sky program in the park. If you are interested in helping the Friends of the Dunes, check out their website at greatsanddunes.org. Even though we interview park rangers, we are not affiliated with the National Park Service, and any views expressed are not necessarily those of the Park Service. We're just fans of the national parks, like you. Coming up in episode 7 of Podcasts with Park Rangers. We're back in Utah at Canyonlands National Park in the remote Needles District with lead interpretive park ranger Shannon Marchak. So far in this podcast, we've heavily featured interpretive rangers. But what's the purpose of park interpretation? Why is it important? We'll talk about the purpose of interpretation, the beauty of Canyonlands, and silence as a resource in our next episode.